Views of Holland. I have always been rather partial to plane geometry, probably because it was the only branch of mathematics that was ever taught me in such a way that I could understand it. For though I have no belief in the power of education to turn public school boys into Newtons, it being quite obvious that, whatever opportunity may be offered, it is only those rare beings desirous of learning and possessing a certain amount of native ability who ever do learn anything. Yet I must insist, in my own defense, that the system of mathematical instruction of which, at Eton, I was the unfortunate victim was calculated not merely to turn my desire to learn into stubborn passive resistance, but also to stifle whatever rudimentary aptitude in this direction I might have possessed. But let that pass. Suffice to say that, in spite of my education and my congenital ineptitude, plane geometry has always charmed me by its simplicity and elegance, its elimination of detail in the individual case, its insistence on generalities. My love for plane geometry prepared me to feel a special affection for Holland, for the Dutch landscape has all the qualities that make geometry so delightful. A tour in Holland is a tour through the first books of Euclid, over a country that is the ideal plane surface of the geometry books. The roads and the canals trace out the shortest distances between point and point. In the interminable polders, the road-top dikes and gleaming ditches intersect one another at right angles, a criss-cross of perfect parallels. Each rectangle of juicy meadowland contained between the intersecting dikes has identically the same area. 5 kilometers long, 3 deep. The figures record themselves on the clock face of the cyclometer. 5 by 3 by how many? The demon of calculation possesses the mind. Rolling along those smooth brick roads between the canals, one strains one's eyes to count the dikes at right angles and parallel to one's own. One calculates the area of the polders they enclose. So many square kilometers. But the square kilometers have to be turned into acres. It is a fearful sum to do in one's head. The more so as one has forgotten how many square yards there are in an acre. And all the time, as one advances, the huge geometrical landscape spreads out on either side of the car, like an opening fan. Along the level skyline, a score of windmills wave their arms like dancers in a geometrical ballet. Ineluctably, the laws of perspective lead away the long roads and shining waters to a misty vanishing point. Here and there, mere real irrelevancies in the midst of this ideal plain. A few black and white cows, out of a picture by Cuyp, browse indefatigably in the lush green grass, or, remembering Paul Potter, mirror themselves like so many ruminating narcissi in the waters of a canal. Sometimes one passes a few human beings, deplorably out of place but doing their best, generally to make up for their ungeometrical appearance by mounting bicycles. The circular wheels suggest a variety of new theorems, and a new task for the demon of calculation. Suppose the radius of the wheels to be 15 inches. Then 15 times 15 times pi will be the area. The only trouble is that one has forgotten the value of pi. Hastily I exercise the demon of calculation that I may be free to admire the farmhouse on the opposite bank of the canal on our right. How perfectly it fits into the geometrical scheme. On a cube, cut down to about a third of its height, is placed a tall pyramid. That is the house. A plantation of trees, set in quincunx formation, surrounds it. The limits of its rectangular garden are drawn in water on the green plain, and beyond these neat ditches extend the interminable flat fields. There are no outhouses, no barns, no farmyard with untidy stacks. The hay is stored under the huge pyramidal roof, and in the truncated cube below live, on one side the farmer and his family, on the other side, during winter only, for during the rest of the year they sleep in the fields, his black and white Cuyp cows. Every farmhouse in North Holland conforms to this type, which is traditional, and so perfectly fitted to the landscape that it would have been impossible to devise anything more suitable. An English farm, with its ranges of straggling buildings, its untidy yard full of animals, its haystacks and pigeon cotes, would be horribly out of place here. In the English landscape, which is all accidents, variety, detail, and particular cases, it is perfect. But here, in this generalized and Euclidean North Holland, it would be a blot and a discord. Geometry calls for geometry. With a sense of the aesthetic properties which one cannot too highly admire, the Dutch have responded to the appeal of the landscape, and have dotted the plain surface of their country with cubes and pyramids. Delightful landscape! I know of no country that is more mentally exhilarating to travel in. No wonder Descartes preferred the Dutch to any other scene. It is the rationalist's paradise. One feels as one flies along in the teeth of one's own 40-mile-an-hour wind, like a Cartesian encyclopedist, flushed with mental intoxication, convinced that Euclid is absolute reality, that God is a mathematician, that the universe is a simple affair that can be explained in terms of physics and mechanics, that all men are equally endowed with reason, and that it is only a question of putting the right arguments before them to make them see the error of their ways and to inaugurate the reign of justice and common sense. Those were noble and touching dreams, commendable inebriations. We are soberer now. We have learned that nothing is simple and rational except what we ourselves have invented, that God thinks neither in terms of Euclid nor of Riemann, that science has explained nothing, that the more we know, the more fantastic the world becomes, and the profounder the surrounding darkness, that reason is unequally distributed, that instinct is the sole source of action, that prejudice is incomparably stronger than argument, and that even in the 20th century men behave as they did in the caves of Altamira and the lake dwellings of Glastonbury. And symbolically one makes the same discoveries in Holland, for the polders are not unending, nor all the canals straight, nor every house a wedded cube and pyramid, nor even the fundamental plane surface invariably plain. That delightful last ride together feeling that fills one, as one rolls along the brick-topped dikes between the canals, is deceptive. The present is not eternal. The last ride through plane geometry comes to a sudden end. In a town, in forests, in the sea-coast, in a winding river or great estuary, it matters little which. All are fundamentally ungeometrical. Each has power to dissipate in an instant all those paralogisms of rationalism, as Professor Rougier calls them, which we have so fondly cherished among the polders. The towns have crooked streets thronged with people. The houses are of all shapes and sizes. The coastline is not straight, nor regularly curved, and its dunes or its dikes, for it must be defended against the besieging waves by art if not by nature, rear themselves inexcusably out of the plain surface. The woods are unscientific in their shady mysteriousness, and one cannot see them for all their individual trees. The rivers are tortuous and alive with boats and barges. The inlets of the sea are entirely shapeless. It is the real world again, after the ideal, hopelessly diversified, complex, and obscure, but when the first regrets are over, equally charming with the geometrical landscape we have left behind. We shall find it more charming, indeed, if our minds are practical and extroverted. Personally, I balance my affections, for I love the inner world as much as the outer. When the outer vexes me, I retire to the rational simplicities of the inner, to the polders of the spirit. And when, in their turn, the polders seem unduly flat, the roads too straight, and the laws of perspective too tyrannous, I emerge again into the pleasing confusion of untempered reality. How beautiful, how curious in Holland that confusion is! I think of Rotterdam with its enormous river, and its great bridges, so crowded with the traffic of a metropolis that one has to wait in files, half a mile long, for one's turn to cross. I think of The Hague, and how it tries to be elegant and only succeeds in being respectable and upper middle class. Of Delft, the commercial city of 300 years ago. Of Haarlem, where in autumn you see them carting bulbs as in other countries they cart potatoes. Of Hoorn and the Zuider Zee, with its little harbour and seaward-looking castle, its absurd museum filled with rich mixed rubbish, its huge storehouse of cheeses, like an old-fashioned arsenal, where the workmen are busy all day long polishing the yellow cannon balls on a kind of lathe and painting them bright pink with an aniline stain. I think of Volendam, one line of wooden houses perched on the seawall, and another line crouching in the low green fields behind the dike. The people at Volendam are dressed as for a musical comedy. Miss Hook of Holland. The men in baggy trousers and short jackets. The women in winged white caps, tight bodices, and 15 superimposed petticoats. 5,000 tourists come daily to look at them, but they still, by some miracle, retain their independence and self-respect. I think of Amsterdam, the old town, like a livelier Bruges, mirrors its high brick houses in the canals. In one quarter, an enormous courtesan sits smiling at every window, the meatiest specimens of humanity I ever saw. At 9 in the morning, at lunchtime, at 6 in the afternoon, the streets are suddenly filled with 300,000 bicycles. Every one in Amsterdam goes to and from his business on a pair of wheels. For the pedestrian as well as the motorist, it is a nightmare. And they are all trick cyclists. Children of 4 carry children of 3 on their handlebars. Mothers pedal gaily along with month-old infants sleeping in cradles fastened to the back carrier. Messenger boys think nothing of taking 2 cubic meters of parcels. Dairymen do their rounds on bicycles specially constructed to accommodate 200-quart bottles of milk in a tray between the 2 wheels. I have seen nursery gardeners carrying 4 palms and a dozen of potted chrysanthemums on their handlebars. I have seen 5 people riding through the traffic on one machine. The most daring feats of the circus and the music hall are part of the quotidian routine in Amsterdam. I think of the dunes near Schorl. Seen from a little distance across the plain, they look like a range of enormous mountains against the sky. Following with the eye the jagged silhouette, one can feel all the emotions aroused, shall we say, by the spectacle of the Alps seen from Turin. The dunes are grand. One could write a canto from Childe Harold about them. And then, unfortunately, one realizes what for a moment one had forgotten, that this line of formidable peaks is not looking down at one from 50 miles away, over the curving flank of the planet. It is just a furlong distant, and the chimneys of the houses at its base reach nearly 2/3 of the way to the top. But what does that matter? With a little goodwill, I insist, one can feel in Holland all the emotions appropriate to Switzerland. Yes, they are grand, the dunes of Schorl and Groot, but I think the grandest sight I saw in non-geometrical Holland was Zaandam. Zaandam from a distance across the plain. We had been driving through the polders and the open country of North Holland. Zaandam was the first piece of ungeometrical reality since Alkmaar. Technically, Zaandam is not picturesque. The guidebook has little to say about it. It is a port and manufacturing town on the Zaan, a few miles north of Amsterdam. That is all. They make cocoa there and soap. The air at Zaandam is charged in alternative strata with delicious vapors of molten chocolate and the stench of boiling fat. In wharves by the shore of the river they store American grain and timber from the Baltic. It was the granaries that first announced from a distance the presence of Zaandam. Like the cathedrals of a new religion, yet unpreached, they towered up into the hazy autumn air, huge oblongs of concrete set on end, almost windowless, smooth, and blankly gray. It was as though their whole force were directed vertically upwards. To look from windows horizontally across the world would have been a distraction. Eyes were sacrificed to this upward purpose. And the direction of that purpose was emphasized by the lines of the alternately raised and lowered panels, into which the wall spaces of the great buildings were divided. Long, fine lines of shadow running up unbrokenly through 100 feet from base to summit. The builders of the Papal Palace at Avignon used a very similar device to give their castle its appearance of enormous height and formidable independence. The raised panels and the shallow blind arches, impossibly long in the leg, with which they variegated the surface of the walls, impart to the whole building an impetuous upward tendency. It is the same with the grain elevators at Zaandam. In the haze of autumnal Holland, I remembered Provence. And I remembered, as I watched those towering shapes growing larger and larger as we approached, Chartres and Bourges and Rheims, gigantic silhouettes seen at the end of a day's driving, towards evening against a pale sky, with the little lights of a city about their base. But if at a distance Zaandam, by its commercial monuments, reminds one of Provençal castles and Gothic cathedrals of France, a nearer view proclaims it to be unequivocally Dutch. At the foot of the elevators, and the only less enormous factories, in the atmosphere of chocolate and soap, lies the straggling town. The suburbs are long but narrow, for they cling precariously to a knife edge of land between two waters. The houses are small, made of wood and gaudily painted, with gardens as large as tablecloths, beautifully kept and filled, at any rate at the season when I saw them, with plushy begonias. In one, as large in this case as two tablecloths, were no less than 14 large groups of statuary. In the streets are men in wooden shoes smoking, dogs drawing carts with brass pots in them, innumerable bicycles. It is the real and not the ideal geometrical Holland. Crowded, confusing, various, odd, charming. But I sighed as we entered the town. The last ride together was over. The dear paralogisms of rationalism were left behind. It was now necessary to face the actual world of men, and to face it, in my case, with precisely 5 words of Dutch. And patois at that, learned years before for the benefit of a Flemish servant. Have you fed the cat? No wonder I regretted the polders. End of Views of Holland.